What's going on, guys? This is Brandon and Gavin.
Back with episode 46 of the Grand Salt Podcast. Jay McIntyre.
He's going to come on. He's going to talk about the extra biblical evidence of the resurrection and what the crucifixion actually was, the severity of Jesus dying on the cross. And so we'll get into it. See ya.
Important to study extra biblical historical record, how horrific and barbaric crucifixion was. And you couldn't even recognize that he was human. When you're thinking of the sweat, the great drops of blood, it forces through the pores, just say his head, to swell up. So then when you add the factor in of the crown of thorns, you've got some thorns on some bushes that are 6-7 inches long. You have someone like Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish historian. He said the crucifixion was, and I quote, the most wretched of all ways of dying, end quote.
Hell, we about to rob hell. Man, I'm finna rob a body bag. Zombie land.
Hey, this is Jay, everybody. Let's give a round of applause. How are you doing, Jay?
Thanks, that was amazing. Doing great.
Jay, I just want to hop straight into it because I know we're kind of on like a little bit of a time crunch here, but what are we talking about today?
So you had talked about discussing like the crucifixion of Jesus, and do I like here or there? You guys,
dude, whatever you want.
Or I'll just look over here. That cool left side.
I have to think about that.
Yeah. So just talking about the crucifixion and all that Jesus went through in his love for us, and I like what you had mentioned, how a lot of people just kind of throw around that phrase, Jesus died for our sins, and which is true, but there's so much that goes into that we in the 21st century Western context don't really think about, because crucifixion doesn't exist today. We don't really hear about people getting crucified, so it's easy for us being so far removed from that to not really know all that really like that entailed.
Wow. So if you guys are paying attention, really would just encourage you guys to really dig deep on this episode. I think God is really going to use this for just an understanding of everything that his son, Jesus Christ, went through for us. And I just think we watched The Passion of the Christ last night, and like even just seeing people who had never seen that movie before, who are newer in their faith, how they respond to that. It's crazy because we really, like you said, I feel like the Western world is spiritually dead to what Jesus went through for us.
Yeah, I would definitely say if you haven't seen The Passion of the Christ, just go watch it, because when you say like he died for our sins, like what you really mean is he did all of that for our sins. It's just much more than just dying, or the way we say it, I'd say.
Right. And like a lot of people are, spiritually ignorant of it, and sometimes willfully ignorant, right? But then there's also, to some degree, you can't really blame people for not knowing all that went into it, because we're so far removed time-wise, culturally, geographically, and if crucifixion was something that happened consistently today, people would be a lot more aware of kind of all that went into it. But because of the different culture and different time period, a lot of people just don't know unless you go and study history and whatnot. So
yeah, it's kind of like how we talk about like World War II and stuff. Like we always talk about like our great grandfathers, our grandfathers, they were in these wars and all these crazy things happened to them. They were in tear gas, they were in Auschwitz or some stuff like that, and it's just like we talk about them with such like gratitude and reverence to like what happened to them. But when it comes to Jesus, it's like it was 1,000 times worse than that, but we speak about it as if it doesn't actually
That's a great point.
matter.
Right. And that's why it's always so important to as best you can study scripture in its context, right? And there's so many different contexts to study scripture in. So for example, like one of the things I teach people all the time is the immediate context of let's say you're taking one verse and you're studying that verse, or even a group of verses. You got to study at least 10 or 15 verses before that, and then 10 to 15 verses after to get that immediate context. But then you also have the further context of whatever book of the Bible it is that you're studying. But then you got to study in the context of the entirety of the Bible, right? So you have those contexts, but then you also you got to study any passage in its cultural context, its historical context, its grammatical context, and so on. There's so many different contexts. So, when you hear about crucifixion, it's easy for us to, okay, you're nailed to a cross, maybe you get beat some, but like it also requires extra biblical study of ancient historical records, because the Bible mentions crucifixion but doesn't go into a lot of detail on on its method and how horrific it was.
Right.
And so that's why it's so important to study extra biblical historical records detailing really how horrific and barbaric crucifixion was. And as you do that, you get that historical context, right? You get that cultural context, and it makes it even more real to you to realize, dang, dude, like the Lord went through all that for us. Like only someone who loves us with an unfailing love would do that.
I do actually have a question. Like, I guess first question, like just jumping in, like in the depiction of the Passion of the Christ, I've heard historically it is not as bad as it would have been. Is that true?
Yeah, for sure. It's bad, right? I mean, you get that scene where after his back is ripped to shreds and the ground is just soaked in his blood. Like that's horrible, right? But I think there's some aspects that the Passion does well. But I don't think any movie can fully portray, well, for sure. There's no movie that could fully portray all that Christ went through, because you don't only have the physical aspect of the torture and the pain, you also have the spiritual aspect of this part where God the Father turns his face away from the Son and rejects Christ. And when you think about that, like that was the first and really kind of the only moment in all of eternity that the Father and the Son did not experience perfect unity.
Wow.
They had only ever experienced perfect unity and perfection together. But when Jesus took on the sins of the entire world for us, Scripture says that he became sin for us. So when he became sin, you can read like Hebrews 4, 2 Corinthians 5. When he became sin for us, the Father turned his face away and poured out the full measure of his wrath upon the Son. And so, like, I personally think that was the worst part. As bad as the physical pain and the torture was, personally, I think that was probably so much worse because of having that unity ripped away for that time when he bore our sins, you know?
Wow. And sorry.
Yeah,
like
go ahead.
even some scholars say the worst part about hell is going to be the fact that we have that disconnect from the Father. Do you think Jesus felt that, like in that moment?
I don't know. Possibly.
Wow.
Yeah. But I mean, he was rejected. If you read Isaiah 53, I mean, he was rejected by the Father, and the Father poured out his wrath. You know, are you in Isaiah 53?
I was about to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Read it, dude.
Yeah. I was about to say about like the Passion of the Christ and what he looked like. I mean, there's verses in Luke and in the Gospels that say that you couldn't tell whether he was a man or a woman. And in Isaiah 52, the end of Isaiah 52, it's the story of the suffering servant. It says that his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of any children of mankind. So, I mean, obviously we knew that was a man. Like in Passion of the Christ, it wasn't even hard to tell that was a man.
You can tell he's a human, right?
You can tell he's a human, you can tell he's a man. So to think that you couldn't tell that, and the fact that he was still alive is just mind-blowing. And then I also was bringing up to Gavin in the car on the way here that it says like John 3:16, his only begotten son, like he forsaked him. And when you could think of that, maybe like Jesus is the Son of God, like that's it. But I feel like when he says begotten, like none of us are. So it's like he only forsakes one person. So that's why it was in his will it says that yet it was in the will of the Lord to crush him and put him into grief. And I mean, I just think that's crazy. It's just like, because I think that that's why Jesus kind of was asking like, why? Like the Garden of, how do you say it? Gethsemane?
Gethsemane.
Like, why he was crying, why he's like, why do I have to do this? And I think that's because he realized like I'm the forsaken one, and like the price that he knew he would have to pay for things that he didn't do. I don't know. It's just insane to me. I was saying like recently I've been imagining God more as a human being, like as the Jesus, and like to view him as like a friend of mine. And I think that's brought me so much closer to him, because I can't imagine a human being looking at me and then taking on all that. I can imagine God doing that because he's so divine and above all of us. But then I think of the man who limited his power to be like the humans, and then someone like that having the willpower to do all that brought me so much closer to God. And my faith is, I feel like, just multitudes.
Yeah. Well, and so coming up in 3 days to Good Friday, you know, I love how we call it Good Friday, and it is good because Sunday came, you know?
Amen.
But like if the resurrection hadn't happened, there would be nothing good about it, you know, because when we talk about Jesus being the sacrifice for our sins, if he didn't rise, then his whole death would have been totally meaningless. It would have been a nice sentiment that he, you know, but he promised that he would rise from the dead. So if he didn't, then he'd be a liar and therefore an unfit sacrifice for our sins. But you know, as we come up, I think it's fitting we're talking about this now, coming up to Good Friday in just a few days. As you know, typically in churches, Good Friday service is more of a somber, sobering thing rather than one of excitement, because you're really focusing on it was that day that Jesus was executed. And, you know, just imagining, studying scripture, looking at all that he went through. And yeah, one of the things that the Passion of the Christ, can't fully, you know, you have Isaiah 52 and 53. You couldn't even recognize that he was human. I mean, that's how bad it was, how bad he was beaten. But in the movie, I mean, like you said, you could totally tell he's still human. But then you also add the factor of, in crucifixion in that day, typically people would be stripped completely naked. And for obvious reasons, you know, they're not going to portray that in the movie, you know, for nudity and whatnot. But like, that's a whole nother factor of the humiliation of, you know, being exposed, your entire body completely naked to anyone and everyone passing by would have been incredibly humiliating. You know, so there's so many factors, you know, in all of that, you know, I don't think any one movie can really capture all that he went through.
Oh yeah.
I wanted to ask a question. So you talked about the extra biblical like evidence of like what crucifixion meant. Mm-hmm. And a couple months ago you spoke about at Fall Retreat, you spoke about picking up your cross.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, what is the extra biblical definition of crucifixion? And why is that important? And then also, how does that come into verses in the Bible, such as like deny yourself and pick up your cross?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent question.
Real quick, before you answer that, could you give some context on exactly what the crucifixion was?
Yeah.
Why it happened? Like why did Rome use it as a form of tormentation? Like what was it?
Yeah, so I'll kind of answer both at the same time. So basically, the Romans didn't invent crucifixion. It was the Medes and the Persians hundreds of years before the Romans that invented it, but the Romans perfected it. The Romans were experts at torture and execution, and which brings up another kind of side note, important point. When it comes to Jesus' resurrection, people love using the skeptics tend to one of their theories they love to go to say Jesus didn't rise is that, well, he never actually died. But that kind of whole theory gets blown out of the water when given the fact of history. And the Romans, they knew when someone was dead. Like you had soldiers who specifically oversaw the executions of people. They knew for sure when people were dead. But that's kind of like a side note about a different thing. But basically the Romans perfected if you even want to really call it an art, but the art of crucifixion and inducing as much pain upon a person as possible and to have it last as long as possible. So a person hanging on a cross would typically actually be alive, suffering on there for several days. It wasn't just what Jesus did for several hours. It was typically several days, which, I mean, there's a good possibility that one of the reasons Jesus died so much sooner is the massive blood loss already from so many things. But, I have just from a few notes that, from, you know, over the years, my different teaching. By the way, just as a side note, a great book, if you guys or anyone watching wants to get, is Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. And in it, there's a whole chapter or two dedicated to him talking to experts, physicians and whatnot of like, could Jesus have survived crucifixion? And them giving so many different from their medical expertise, their perspective on stuff of what Jesus went through. That's really, really beneficial, very eye-opening, insightful stuff.
I'm going to guess short answer is no.
No. Not with everything he endured. So let me just go through a few of my notes from years of teaching on this. So, let's go back to the Garden of Gethsemane for a minute. So you have passages like Luke 22, I think Mark probably 14 or 15, and Matthew 26, where Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's pleading with the Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And I believe it's in the Luke 22 passage that it said that he was in such incredible agony that he began to actually sweat great drops of blood. So there's, I didn't put in my notes here. I have like notes scattered everywhere but basically, I'm trying to remember the exact term for this, but you have, these parts in your body, the thrombi, that basically it's been scientifically shown that when a person is under extreme duress, great pressure, a lot of distress, they can actually sweat blood.
Yeah, this has happened other times too. Mm-hmm. Remember when I first read that, I was like, let me search this up, and it's like actually a thing. Like, if you can get anxious enough, basically, to where you're so worried about something that you are sweating blood.
Yeah, it's hematohydrosis.
Yeah, hematidrosis for sure.
Yeah.
So basically, it's only under extreme conditions, right?
Wow.
And so basically, what most likely would have happened with Jesus is, when you're thinking of the sweat, the great drops of blood, it forces through the pores, which can cause like your skin, let's just say his head, to swell up extremely, like a lot bigger, a lot larger than is typical. So then when you add the factor in of the crown of thorns, right? Let's say his head is swollen, a couple times, it's with the skin bulging out because of all the blood in his head. In the skin, you add those crown of thorns that I lived in Israel for a time. And I mean, you've got some thorns, on some bushes that are 6-7 inches long, and they weave this around, put on his head. And then it says they took a reed and hit him on the head. So when those thorns puncture the head, it would be kind of like popping a balloon. I mean, the blood would just spurt and gush from his head, like extreme. But then you also add to that when Jesus was blindfolded, and then what did they do when they blindfolded him when he was on trial? Hit him in the face. So when you think of like, if you have someone coming up to you and you see a punch coming, there's an incredible like mechanism God put within your body that without even thinking about it, your muscles kind of tense up and as like they add like a protective layer when you see a hit coming. When you don't see a hit coming, it is so much more, it packs a much stronger punch. That's why like with quarterbacks in football, anytime you hear about a quarterback getting blindsided, the injury is typically a whole lot worse. A concussion or something is so much worse because they don't see it coming. So their body doesn't have the ability to react with tensing up and giving that protective cushion. Wow. So when Jesus is blindfolded and you can't see a hit coming and they're striking him with the palms of their hands and hitting him in the face, it would have caused extreme swelling, extreme bruises, and be so much more painful, But then they take him from Jesus was on trial 6 different times, 6 different trials. So before Caiaphas, Annas, I think Caiaphas again, Pilate twice, and then Herod once. So he was on trial 6 different times, but during all of those, eventually, Pilate allows him to be flogged, right? So the flogging by the Romans was, I'll kind of share a few details
the whipping, right?
About that. Yeah. Extremely brutal stuff. Like I said, Romans were experts on torturing people and keeping them alive, like bringing on a person such horrible torture, but just enough to where they won't die, to then keep them alive longer and then torture them more, just enough to then keep them alive longer, and so on. So basically a typical Roman flogging would entail 39 lashes. from a whip that was intertwined with pieces of glass, pieces of bones, and then metal balls woven into it as well. So the metal balls would cause deep bruises in the flesh, while the glass and the bone would just shred. It would just rip the flesh apart. Eventually, like, a person's back would basically look like raw hamburger meat. I mean, that's how bad it would have been. And in some cases, it's been reported that, like, a person's spine could be exposed and showing. Yeah, so, I mean, horrible stuff. But then the whipping, typically we just think of like the back, but typically the person would have been stripped, and it would go from their back or their shoulders to the back of their legs. Wow. So, and everything in between. Yeah. So it's not just like a few inches of your back that's being whipped. It's your butt, your thighs, and so on. And you'd end up with just like ribbons of mangled flesh just dangling from a person's body. Victims' veins were often laid bare, and muscles, sinews would be open to exposure, which that alone can cause extreme pain because they never see oxygen, they never see the air, right? Or a breeze. And so that alone could just cause a lot of pain. There's one physician, I don't remember the exact name, but I'll give you a quote, who says that the flogging usually resulted in, quote, rib fractures and severe lung bruises and lacerations, with bleeding into the chest cavity and partial or complete pneumothorax, which is collapse of the lung. So obviously in Jesus's case, we know, given what John says and messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, Jesus didn't break any bones, which could be typical in some Roman floggings. But I mean, the point being, Jesus endured so much agony, so much physical pain and torture. And that kind of begs the question, for what? Yeah. Because when you think about what he says to Pilate, hey, and I think he says it actually, to the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane when they're arresting him and Peter, hacks off Malchus's ear. I think it's there that Jesus tells him, hey, if I wanted to, I could call down 12 legions of angels. And like, Jesus didn't have to go through any of this.
Yeah, isn't it right before he got crucified? Like, they call out to Jesus saying, like, there was like 12 legions of angels with their swords drawn, and he's like, don't send them.
I don't recall that being in scripture, but he does say I could do this, and he even tells Pilate, like, my kingdom is not of this world. And, if I had my guys fight, like, you'd all be toast, but the point being, Jesus didn't have to endure any of this. He could have just ended all of these people's lives. He could have healed himself completely right then and there, but he didn't. And it's incredible to just think about all these different aspects that while Jesus is going through this, when you think of creation account, when you think of John 1, when it says that Jesus is the one who created all things, when you think of Hebrews 1:3 and Colossians 1, like 15 through 18, when it says that it's by the word of Jesus that he's holding each person's life together. So, like, as these Roman soldiers are flogging Jesus, he's giving them the strength in their arms and their bodies, the breath in their lungs to be able to do that. He's sustaining their life, enabling them to do that to him. When I think it's Caiaphas or Annas is accusing him, it's incredible when you think about it, because you have this high priest, Caiaphas, accusing the great high priest, Jesus. And Jesus is allowing him to falsely accuse him. Like, Jesus has given him the breath to be able to do that. Jesus is giving every single person the ability to do what they do to him.
I feel like a lot of times we don't understand, like, we think of Jesus dying for us. And when we think of us, we think of the holy people that were there watching Jesus get beat. But in reality, like, he died for King Herod and stuff. Like, he died for, like, Pilate. He died for Judas. He died for all the people that betrayed him, basically.
Right.
Which I think nobody thinks about.
I think something that I think about often is that Jesus was perfect. And so he never was able to look at a brother or sister and have any hatred towards them. which is something that we'll never understand. I don't think we'll ever, like, if we were to go through that, there's no way I could sit there and look at these people and like still have love for them. Like, I just can't, and even you see it on the cross, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. It's like, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. Like, he's such a pure heart for these people. That's just so genuine. And like, that's what touches me so much when I think about the story of the crucifixion. So even up on the cross, after everything he's endured, he's begging their Father, he's interceding for them. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. That this thing is, that touches my heart a lot. So much about the crucifixion.
Well, and there's something amazing about that statement. So there's 7 sayings of Jesus while he's on the cross. 7 statements he makes while on the cross. And that's one of them. And it's amazing because none of our English translations fully capture exactly what we capture what he's saying, but there's something that no English translation that I have found fully captures what's going on there. So in the Greek language, the original language, when Luke 23 records, and he said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. The word said there is in what's called the imperfect tense, which means continual action in the past only. So in other words, the point being, Jesus said this statement, Father, forgive them for they know not what they're doing. He said it more than once. It wasn't just this one time because it's the imperfect tense is, he said it continually in the past. So now, how many times did he say it? We don't know. Where else was it as he's carrying his cross? Is it as they're beating him? Is it as they're blindfolding him, hitting him in the face? We don't know, but we know from the original language, he said it more than once. So, it's not something you just say once and then like, oh shoot, like that was a stupid thing to pray. Like he's repeatedly asking the Father, forgive them.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
So then you have, basically the Romans as part of the punishment for a criminal, which obviously Jesus wasn't a criminal, but, they sort of, it's strange. They sort of considered him one, even though Pilate numerous times tells the people, I find no fault with him, which, I mean, as a little bit of a side note, Pilate is a total scumbag. A lot of people think like, oh yeah, Pilate's not that bad because he even kind of agrees with Jesus. But I mean, if you went into a court of law today and you heard a judge, the person who has the power to either execute someone or set them free, and a judge says numerous times, I think it's at least 6 times, he says, he's innocent. And you go into a court of law and people are asking for the death of a person, and the judge says multiple times he's innocent, and then at the end he says, okay, fine, go ahead and kill him anyways. Like, Pilate is a wicked man, a totally corrupt judge, and he does it for self-serving political reasons, to make himself look good in the eyes of Rome. But Pilate acknowledges Jesus' innocence, but he still hands him over to be murdered. And so basically Romans would force the criminal to carry part of their own cross to their site of crucifixion. So this was, in Latin, it was called the patibulum. This was the crossbeam piece of the cross. So in, I think it's probably Passion of the Christ portrays it as the whole cross. Most movies portray it as the whole cross. There's no way. They definitely would not have done that because that would have weighed more than probably almost any person could carry, especially that distance. The patibulum alone would have weighed around probably about 100 pounds.
Wow.
And that's the short part, right? The crossbeam. The vertical, piece would have weighed so much more. So Jesus carries it, right? And that's like extra humiliating, adding insult to injury, right? Because it's almost like telling someone, making them dig their own grave before you execute them and throw them in. Like you have to carry the very thing you're going to be hung on.
Was Jesus crucified in a different place than where others were usually? Because I remember I heard you say that they would usually have people crucified outside of the city gates, so that when you would come in, you would see them. Yeah.
So typically in those times, it probably depends on the city. I don't know exactly for Jerusalem, but they would typically have crosses kind of all over the place as places, especially where people would pass by. So outside the gates of cities, leading to cities, So in fact, if you study, I can't remember exactly which ancient historian, but basically the streets for, I think, at least a mile or more leading into Rome, the city of Rome, would be lined with crosses. In fact, there's historical accounts that say people just said there was a horrible stench.
Wow.
Like, anyone going to Rome, the stench was horrible, at least I think a mile before even getting into the city, because it was just, you had corpses hanging on crosses, and it was like a disgusting thing. It was but a fear tactic that Rome would use, whether it's in Rome or Jerusalem or any cities that they had power over. In essence, they're saying, hey, don't mess with Rome, or this is going to happen to you.
Yeah, I don't think that it was put in any place maybe special, because you got to think, like, it could have been Barabbas, so then it wouldn't have even been Jesus, and it probably still would have been in the same spot. So it's like, I don't know if Jesus necessarily was a driving factor of where it was located.
Well, and also there was other two criminals who.
Them as
Right.
So I was just wondering, because I know it's been talked about he was on top of like the mountain, but it's like I've also heard that it's in different places. But I was just wondering.
Yeah, so he was crucified on the hill Golgotha, also called Calvary. Luke refers to it as Calvary. The other Gospels, I think, call it Golgotha, and Luke might call it that as well, but he also calls it Calvary. And there is debate today amongst Bible scholars and historians of where exactly. There's two sites in Jerusalem, and you have the city walls of Jerusalem today that have been around for centuries, but a lot of historians, archaeologists say the actual walls during Jesus' time were a lot further in, like they're actually inside of what's currently the old city. And so you have like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a really prominent Catholic church where they believe Golgotha was at the time. And then you have a British-owned Protestant Christian site right outside the current walls of the old city of Jerusalem, right next to this, huge Arab bus station, or like rental bus stop. But inside this beautiful garden, I mean, it's this beautiful garden that these British Christians have kind of kept up, maintained. There is a tomb there that a lot of people think, may have been Jesus's tomb. And it may actually be the tomb of Jesus, maybe not what they consider to be Golgotha. It may be the tomb that's debated between those two places. But still to this day, if what's traditionally viewed as what Golgotha was, you could actually still see a skull kind of naturally the mountain, which, I mean, they called it Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And if you look at it today, but I think partially because of the decomposition of the mountain and the rocks over the years, if you look at pictures from decades ago, it's a little clearer, but you could still see kind of like the eyes, the nose, maybe part of a mouth that looks like a natural skull in the mountain, just, kind of probably about the size of this wall here.
Wow.
But, that's debated. But yeah, so he was taken to the place of the skull, Golgotha, to be crucified, and he has to carry the crossbeam. But obviously, we know the gospel accounts record that Simon of Cyrene was forced by the Romans to help Jesus carry his cross, because no doubt, probably he was so weak because of the blood loss, the trauma, and just exhausted, going through everything that he did. And the Gospels record that as he's doing this humiliating walk, possibly naked, that women are there and they are weeping, and Jesus tells them, bless you, Jesus tells them, hey, don't weep for me, weep for you guys.
Wow.
For what's gonna come next. And just all these different things. So but then you have Jesus gets to Golgotha, right? And so going back for a minute to kind of crucifixion being, at that time, it was definitely the worst possible way for a person to die. Since then, people have invented, with sick, twisted, evil minds, other ways to torture people. But at the time, 100%, I think there was a consensus among pretty much everyone. Crucifixion was the most horrific way for a person to die. So you have someone like Cicero, who was a Roman statesman. He was an orator. He was a philosopher. He lived from 106 BC to 43 BC, and he said the crucifixion was the grossest, most hideous manner of execution.
Wow.
You have someone like Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, like very shortly after the time of Jesus, who he said the crucifixion was, and I quote, the most wretched of all ways of dying, end quote. So, I mean, there was a consensus. People of that time knew no one wants to die this way.
Could you explain the word crucifixion?
Yeah, I'll explain some of the horrors of what a person would experience. So basically, nails would be driven into the wrists of a person. Some movies, you see it right here in the hand. Most likely, that wasn't how it was, because it could cause the nail to just kind of rip right through the hand as they're hanging there. So most likely, nails would have been driven right here through the wrists, with about 7-inch spikes to lock the hand in position. And so the nails would be driven right here through what's called your median nerve. And it's the longest nerve, that goes out to your hand. So the pain that someone would experience with something like a nail being driven through the median nerve, it would be like if you took a pair of pliers and like your funny bone, the pain you feel when like you hit your funny bone, it would sort of be like if you took a pair of pliers, clamped down on your funny bone and just squeezed as hard as you could and twisted that. I mean, just horrible pain. In fact, the pain that a person experienced on a cross was so extreme that actually they had to invent a whole new word for the pain that they experienced. And the word that they came up with is, translated to English, it's our English word excruciating.
I'll never forget that since you said that.
Yeah, so our English word excruciating comes from a Latin word, that literally means out of the cross.
Wow.
So, when you ask a person, how much pain are you in? Oh, it's excruciating. A lot of times it isn't as bad as being on a cross, but we have that word excruciating in English to mean extreme, like worst of the worst pain. And that's the word that they actually invented in that time for the kind of pain a person would experience. Because not only do you have the pain there, eventually a victim's shoulders would experience dislocation from being hanging on the cross, like this. If you're hanging like this for a long time and having to go up, your shoulders eventually can dislocate, which that would have been a fulfillment of the prophecy of Psalm 22:14 of Jesus's shoulders being out of joint or dislocated. You also have something called causalgia, which is basically like after a couple hours, a victim on the cross would experience causalgia, which here's a quote. It says, "The pain is an unrelenting, peculiar burning or searing sensation that is so intense that even gentle contacts like clothing or air drafts cause utter torture.
Wow.
It may be aggravated by movement, jarring, noise, or emotion. The pain traverses the arm like lightning bolts. Victims of causalgia frequently go into shock if the pain is not controlled." End quote. And I don't remember exactly where I got that quote from, but I mean, just to give you an idea, experiencing like fire, like lightning in your arms.
I feel like I felt something similar to this. So one time, it was my funny bone. I hit it so hard, I felt like my arm from here to here was like on fire, and I was like literally on my bed like, for like 10 minutes, and I was like, I think I'm gonna die. Like I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what happened, but if that's what he felt in his whole body, I can't even imagine it.
Yeah, and that's for hours, right? I mean, that's typically, this quote says that after, a short time, a person can go into shock because of how bad the pain is, but Jesus was on the cross for many hours, But then you also have like the nail or nails possibly in his feet, right? So as Jesus hangs on the cross, he has to the way to breathe, you have to be pushing down on your feet to lift up to exhale and then go down to inhale. That's a lot of studies have shown that that's the way in order to breathe on the cross during that time. So as he pushes up on his feet with nails in his feet, the nails tear through muscles, tendons, sinews, and then lock up against his tarsal bones in his feet. And that's every time, right, that he wants to breathe. So just that pain alone would have been so intense. But then eventually you can only do that for so long, right? Doing that for every breath you want to take, that a person would eventually be so exhausted that typically people would die of suffocation on a cross. Like I said, people would be crucified, probably not flogged as bad as Jesus was, and with the crown of thorns and the beating, blindfold, all that stuff. They would typically last several days, even a week on a cross. And it was, for anyone, Rome's law was that anyone who tried to aid a person hanging on a cross by getting them off a cross, or even putting them out of their misery by killing them, that person would then be crucified.
Wow.
So like, aiding in any way a person on a cross was punishable by death by crucifixion.
That's crazy.
So it's like, again, that fear tactic of like, do not mess with Rome. People were terrified of crucifixion. So, and the fear tactic worked because you can imagine, let's say you're going to school as a kid, or if you're going to work, or you're going as a Jew to synagogue, and you're just hearing people screaming in pain, begging for death, begging for passersby to just, dude, kill me. The moans, the screams, the agony that they're in, and the sight to see that is just, it put fear into people of the Roman Empire and their power, and not to mess with them. And so you can kind of understand to some degree the disciples' fear for the next couple days, is they're just hiding in this upper room, terrified that they're next. So, I mean, it's an incredibly slow death, extremely painful. And that's just, those aren't even all the details, but those are just some of the details of what Jesus would have experienced, the physical aspect of the pain, the suffering, and, but again, personally, I think the worst part was probably when the Father turns his face away and Jesus endures the full measure of God's wrath for the sins of the entire world. I mean, that's something that none of us could ever fathom, and no movie could ever portray what that experience must have been like, because none of us could endure that. None of us could bear even the weight of our own sin, right? To take every sin of the world for all of history and bear it in punishment in order to save humanity, I don't think we'll ever be able to fathom what that must have been like, what Jesus experienced there.
You know what I just think about? Maybe when he was anxious and was on the cross, he's like, why have you forsaken me? Maybe he was more anxious, not over the fact that he knew what he was about to endure, but over the fact that he didn't know if God was going to like take him back, in a sense. Like if he's like, he knows he's going to get forsaken. Do you think he was more scared of being forsaken? Because you say like the worst part was not being with God, basically. I feel like the story of picking up your cross and like just that image that you just painted over the past like 40 minutes of how bad the crucifixion was, it's like, I feel like it just calls me to evangelize. Like if I see someone that I know, and it's like, I feel like a lot of the times Christians will think that it's my actions, like the way you live your life is going to be enough basically to bring these other people to Christ, which God says will happen. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I've grasped the concept of crucifixion, and I feel like I imagine that, and I think, wow, like what happened to Jesus isn't as bad as what's happening to every single person in hell right now. Because at least Jesus went back with the Father after all that pain. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's just like a call to evangelize, I feel. I don't know. I had a question, but I forgot the question.
Yeah, well, in that same passage in 2 Corinthians 5, when Paul says that Jesus, who knew no sin, became sin for us. And just a couple verses before, Paul says that we, as believers, are ambassadors for Christ, pleading with people. We exhort you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. And that is our responsibility as Christians. And something just as an encouragement for anyone watching and for all of us is, if a person ever doubts God's love for them, I think the simplest thing they could do is look at the cross.
Wow.
Look at what Jesus went through. I think that's one of the greatest proofs of God's love for us. And in Romans 5:8, I think a verse that we all know so well, it sums it up so well, that God demonstrated his own love for us. That while we were still sinners, enemies of God, that's when Christ died for us. He didn't, Jesus didn't die for people after they cleaned themselves up and did a bunch of good deeds. It was while we were the worst of the worst, and like you said, Jesus on the cross is dying for the people that are hanging him on the cross. And the centurion who says, truly, this was the Son of God. Like he got part of that, right? Jesus was, but really he is. The guy didn't know Jesus was going to rise, but you even have later in the book of Acts, some of the religious leaders getting saved. Some of the priests who no doubt could have been part of this conspiracy to execute Jesus. It says, I think it's in Acts 6, around the time of Stephen, that even some of the priests were coming to know Christ. So Saul, who became Paul, right? We don't know for sure if he was there at the crucifixion of Jesus, if he was one of the Pharisees, conspiring to execute Jesus. We don't know, but he certainly was a major, one of the biggest persecutors of early Christianity. Jesus died for him too, and he got radically saved, So the cross is, people today wear it around their neck as a piece of jewelry, right? Which there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong or sinful or whatever about it. If people want to do it, go for it. Or they have it tattooed on their body or different things.
I'm feeling really called out right now.
Yeah, well, and that's fine. But my point being is, today it's like a comforting symbol. It's a religious symbol. It's something that people use as jewelry, which again, I don't think in and of itself any of that's wrong. My point just simply being is that today, because, thank God, we don't experience and see crucifixion happening to people, and that horrible, horrific type of torture, because we're so far removed time-wise from it and geographically, and it's taken on a different sort of meaning, because for most people, when they see a cross on someone's neck, they might think of something religious, but they don't typically think of the most barbaric, horrific way for a person to die in the first century.
We think of righteousness, when in reality it was the most unrighteous thing there was.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And the cross really says two things along those lines. The cross shows how horrible our sin really is. For anyone who thinks, yeah, my sin isn't that bad. No, like, if no one else in all of history had sinned and you only sinned, you were the only one who sinned, and all you did was tell a lie, that would have been enough for the cross. Like, that's how horrific, how evil our sin is, but it's also a sign of how incredibly great God's love is for us.
Wow. I wanted to ask, you said that Good Friday is only good because Sunday came. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you the extra biblical evidence of the resurrection. Like, why should we believe that he actually died for our sins? He didn't just say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, dude, that's a long one to answer. Typically when I teach on this, the resurrection, it's like a 3 or 4 hour plus teaching. So giving evidence for
so pretend I'm
the resurrection.
A Muslim on the street, and I say,
well, that part's really easy, because I think this is one of the great evidences that totally debunks Islam as a false religion, is
they died.
Muslims reject the belief that Jesus ever even died. which there's so much evidence, not just scripturally, but extra biblically. We have so many extra biblical accounts from people that lived in that time. Enemies of Jesus, they'd even say, yeah, Jesus died. Like we crucified him, or we know the people who did crucify him. You have Tacitus, you have, Jewish documents, you have different Roman documents. Josephus is another. You have so many that totally testify of Jesus's crucifixion and death. So it's like, okay, who are we going to believe? All the first century people that talked about it, or a dude who lived 500 years after Jesus that just said, no, he didn't die. Like, I'm going to bank on the Bible and those other accounts. But as far as evidence for the resurrection, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't die from the dead, then our faith, Christianity, it's vain. It's meaningless. Yeah. There really is no Christianity without the resurrection. As great and as wonderful as his death is, if he didn't rise, then it would all be meaningless. For many purposes, I shared one of those earlier. But there's so much evidence. There's a couple books I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe you guys in like the YouTube description sure. I can send it to you and you could put in the book titles. But there's one I think by Gary Habermas and I want to say Michael Licona. I think it's called The Resurrection of Jesus, or The Case for the Resurrection, or Evidence for the Resurrection, something like that. And they do a fascinating job. Like Case for Christ is another great one because he also talks about evidence for the resurrection. But you have so many different things. For example, one, the empty tomb. I'll take three pieces of evidence. Now, I don't think just any one of them proves that Jesus rose from the dead, but there's strong evidence. It's kind of like cumulative. You add all of them together.
Well, that's the same for everything, honestly.
A lot of things, yeah. So the fact that the tomb is empty is incredible evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, obviously, the tomb being empty is the only possibility that a person rose? Well, no. There's the theories that his body was stolen, or, he didn't really die, or different things. So then you got to address those, and people have, and there's really good arguments for why it's not plausible at all to believe the disciples stole Jesus' body. For example, their former cowardice that they displayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? What did they all do? It says, Matthew 26, they all forsook Jesus and fled. They were terrified.
It literally says, like, the Romans said that this is what they might do, so put soldiers there.
Right, exactly. Matthew 27, I think. And then you have Peter. What does he do? Denies Jesus 3 times. That he even knows him out of fear and to save his own skin. Then you have the day and a half or 2 days after Jesus rose, the disciples are all hiding like a bunch of wimps up in this upper room, terrified, right? So it's totally unreasonable. By the way, some people might say, well, how could we trust the gospel accounts? Well, that's a whole nother study for another time. And there's been tons of great material that's been written on this, but there's really good reason to believe that the 4 gospel accounts we have are reliable, testimonies. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that they are reliable testimonies, reliable historical accounts. It's totally unreasonable then to say the disciples somehow, between this time when they're so fearful, acting like cowards, to then suddenly work up the courage to take on all of Rome, because if the Romans would have put the Roman seal over the tomb, which breaking a Roman seal was punishable by death. And I believe actually by upside down crucifixion. So there's no way the disciples, it's not plausible or probable to believe that the disciples somehow worked up the courage to then steal the body of Jesus, and for what? And then to go back Sunday morning, back in the upper room, terrified. By the way, they were the very first skeptics, right? When they see Jesus, it says they didn't even believe it was him. When the women come and tell them, we saw Jesus, they don't believe it. So it's amazing, because the very first skeptics of the resurrection are the very followers of Jesus.
Wow, that's crazy.
So people who try to say, oh yeah, they just invented it to try to, no, they were the skeptics, So there's a lot of reasons to believe that it's not plausible that the tomb was empty for any other reason than that he rose. Another really good reason, that it's not plausible to believe that the body was stolen, or not so much that the body was stolen, or that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, is because where did the disciples start preaching the message of the resurrection?
Probably right there, I imagine.
It wasn't in Rome. It wasn't in Athens. It was right where it happened. So the point being, the Jewish religious leaders hated Jesus, hated the origins and spread of Christianity. They did everything they could to stop it. And you see that really in the book of Acts. The Romans also viewed Christianity and the spread of it as a threat to the Roman Empire. So you have religious and political reasons that these two parties, the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman Empire, they did not want Christianity being spread. So if the disciples are preaching that Jesus rose from the dead, the easiest thing to do to debunk the entire religion and settle any doubts people had, take all of Jerusalem on a little field trip, ride over a couple 100 yards to the tomb, roll back the stone, present the corpse, and then boom, Christianity's done for.
Yeah.
But there's no historical account of them doing that. In fact, there's no single historical account we have, even from hostile witnesses, enemies of Christianity, saying that Jesus was still in the tomb after the third day.
Wow.
Not a single one.
Wow.
There's tons that acknowledge that Jesus was killed, and many that acknowledge he was put in a tomb, but none of them say, by the way, his body's still there, because they knew it wasn't. So then that does raise the question, well, was his body stolen? Again, there's a lot of reasons you can safely assume, okay, if you're a detective going to a crime scene and doing this, I think pretty much any detective would rule out the stolen body theory. So that's one piece of evidence, and there's a lot more we could, for a couple hours, just get into the empty tomb. Yeah. But the second piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is the post-mortem appearances. Jesus appearing to people after he died. And again, this is like Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. He appeared to Cephas. He appeared to the other disciples, appeared to Paul, appeared to all, we're talking hundreds, several hundred people that Jesus appeared to after his death. And so that's an incredible piece of evidence. Now, again, there's refutations. There's theories people have that skeptics pose, which, I mean, that's okay to do that because we don't want to just believe something by blind faith, right? So it is important to say, okay, well, are there any theories that could go against this? Are there any arguments against this? I think that's a good thing to think about. And some of the arguments that skeptics have made is what's called the hallucinations theory. They say the disciples, the disciples were hallucinating. They were seeing visions or trances. But
I mean, obviously,
I don't know if you guys remember, if you were there, I think it was last year, the week of, it was, I guess, last year this time at Crew when I came in and shared. Yes, John asked me to come share on evidence for the resurrection. And I briefly talked about, professional psychiatrists have shown like there's multiple factors that have to be in play for people to hallucinate. And none of them actually fit with what the evidence shows for Jesus's post-mortem appearances. In other words, there's no way that all these people could have been hallucinating.
Yeah.
By the way, so I'll give you like one or two. So basically, hallucinations happen only to people who are usually highly imaginative, high-strung, nervous, anxious people, right? And not like nervous, anxious here and there, because that happens to all of us, right? We're talking about like always like that. That doesn't fit with the disciples, right? It also happens to people who are usually paranoid, schizophrenic, who also have an anticipation of something good coming in the near future. Well, that doesn't fit at all with the disciples, right? Because if you look at when Jesus appears to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, are they anticipating something great in the future? No. They're all downcast, like our hopes are shattered.
And Jesus rebukes them. They were talking about how Jesus was dead.
Right. And they said, man, all our hopes were in him, and now, well, that's gone. Yeah. You have the disciples hiding up in the upper room, terrified. They're not expecting anything good coming after that. So all of the factors that have to be in play for people to experience hallucinations, visions, trances, none of them fit with what the evidence shows the disciples were going through.
Right.
Also, another key factor is psychiatrists have said hallucinations are a lot like dreams in the sense that it always happens to individual people. It never happens to groups of people. So it's like if you guys go to class tomorrow and you're hanging out with your friends and someone says, dude, wasn't that dream last night that we all had amazing? It's like, that doesn't happen. Yeah. People don't have the same dream together.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with hallucinations. It happens to individuals. So the whole theory, these 500 people are hallucinating, doesn't add up. You know, and another important factor is the character. The character is key for all of these different people. We don't know who all of the 500 people are, but we know who quite a few of them are, that are mentioned. You know, Paul, Peter, the other disciples. These people were known to be people with honest, noble character, having integrity, telling the truth, and having noble character, right? And so when you take all of these factors, if we were to go into a court of law today and you have 500 witnesses testify to a really important event, and all of these people have reputations in the community, everyone who knows them testifies that these 500 witnesses, they have noble character, they're people of integrity, they care about truth, they're honest in their dealings, they're not liars. Is a jury just going to throw out all these 500? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Like that is incredible evidence for something. Yeah. Okay. A person's character plays a huge role. It's a huge factor in any case. And so you have the post-mortem appearances. And again, we could spend another couple hours just on that one. Yeah. But then the third really strong piece of evidence is the changed lives of the disciples. And, this is a really good one as well. Changed lives alone is not necessarily enough evidence for something. For example, a lot of Muslims like to use this as proof that the Quran is inspired by God. Well, look at how many lives it's changed. Well, the Book of Mormon has changed many lives. And you could even, some people might argue, for the better. Maybe they used to do a lot of bad stuff, but now, they do some morally good stuff because of the influence this has had. But that alone isn't proof that something is true.
Right.
But when you think about the disciples that changed, this radical transformation that happens in their life, will people die for something that is a lie? Yes. But they're convinced that it's true. Right? Good. People die for a lie all the time. Yeah, Muslims die for Islam, but Islam is a lie, right? Yeah. Other people, missionaries of different faiths, have died for their religion that was a lie. But here's the distinction. They thought it was true. Yeah. They believed it was true. No one ever dies for what they know to be a lie.
Yeah.
In fact, if you study, like church history, this is mostly church history. Like most of the deaths of the disciples are not recorded in the Bible. A few of them are, but most of them aren't. But so this is more like traditional church history, but there's, I think, good reason to believe it because again, reliable accounts. Almost all of the disciples, the 12 disciples, but then many others, they suffered horrific deaths. Horrible deaths. If you look into it, a great book detailing this is pretty much any church history book probably talks about it. There's a great one by Bruce Shelley called Bruce Shelley something church history. It's like a great one. But then you have Fox's Book of Martyrs. It opens up with detailing the executions of the disciples. But you have people like Paul. Before he was beheaded on the Appian Way to Rome, you look at all that he suffered for Christ. And he kind of details this a little bit in 2 Corinthians 12. I've been whipped, I think, 195 times for Christ.
He said he got whipped 5 sets of 39.
Yeah. So I think that's 195 maybe.
Wow.
This has happened to me. That's happened to me. Like, I've been shipwrecked. I've been beaten with rods as well. I've been stoned and all this different stuff. Like, no one endures that much pain and torture and excruciating death for what they know to be a lie. They might do it for what's a lie that they think is true, but no one endures that for what they know is false. So the whole theory that, well, the disciples knew it wasn't true and they just tried to spread it anyways, maybe if they didn't suffer the way they did, but with the way that they suffered, and it's not just they themselves, but like their families. You know, you have as Saul, before he became Paul, is going around, he's murdering tons of Christians. And you look at in Rome, they didn't distinguish between man or woman or child. Like anyone who named the name of Christ was fed to the lions, was torn apart by the beast, was killed by the gladiators, was crucified, dipped in tar and ignited. Like, I mean, no one goes through this for what they know is like, okay, it's false, but we got to spread it to convince people that it's true.
Yeah, I think I use this all the time to explain to people, because you can't really use any of this to prove that Jesus is God, but you can make it to where it's like, that's probably what happened. That's probably true, because just because those people died doesn't prove that Jesus's words are true, but it believes that they believed he was God.
Yeah.
They believed that what he said was true.
Right.
And that makes you believe that, oh, okay, so Jesus probably was God. And even if he's not, it's like, you should take his words, being as just a man, say you're an atheist or whatever, or a Muslim, you should be like, take his words very seriously. Yeah. And then you get into like, which books should I read? Which are the words of God?
Yeah. So like in law enforcement and, you know, like in prosecutions and stuff, they refer to this as beyond reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Right? Beyond reasonable doubt, there is so much good evidence to come to the conclusion that Jesus really did live in human history. Jesus really did die on a cross. And 3, Jesus did rise from the dead. Following the evidence where it leads, the tomb is definitely empty. We have eyewitness testimonies of hundreds of people of noble characters saying they saw him alive, and their enemies don't dispute it. Okay. And so on and so forth, what they went through to show and proclaim the message. And so it really just kind of leads to, beyond reasonable doubt, there's good evidence to believe that Jesus really did rise from the dead. And that kind of leads to the conclusion, if he did rise, then what does that say about who he is? Yeah. He is exactly who he claimed to be. Yeah. God.
Most likely.
Yeah. So if he is God, then, I mean, that means he's Lord, and our only proper response from every human is to submit to his lordship, to surrender their life and follow Jesus.
And I'm going to be honest, I hope that anybody of you guys listening, what he just described, is actually the reason I came to Jesus, because I just could not have this faith-based, blind faith type of coming to the Lord. It just wasn't in the cards for the way my brain thinks. So knowing that is what I would say sparks my faith in the Lord.
Yeah, and I was even going to say, like, it's through grace by faith we're saved. And so Jesus didn't even have to give us any of this evidence that we're discussing now. He didn't have to appear to 500 people. He didn't have to give us all these historical documents that we have now. But I think it's just so in his nature that he did, because he knows there's going to be people like Brandon who needed that for some sort of faith. So I just think it's kind of beautiful how even 2,000 years later, we're sitting here with the evidence to support it. Maybe we can 100% believe it, but there is an element of faith attached to it. And I think it's so awesome how he even gives us just a little bit of evidence to prove, like, maybe what he's saying is true. And obviously we know it is, but I just think that it's so cool to see that in his nature, he does that and provides that for us.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah. Hey, thank you.
I wish we could talk for like 10 hours. I literally just...
Oh, I know, dude. You get me started on apologetics, and dude, I won't shut up. So,
really quick before we started, Jay did let us know. I didn't even know this, but he's actually written a few books. So I would love if maybe you wanted to just let people know about him.
Wait, you know what we should do? Yeah. We'll do like the intro, and then we'll have him shout it out in the beginning, because more people are going to hear the beginning. You want to do that?
True. Yeah. But you can say them now too if you want.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, a few years ago, I wrote one book that I ended up splitting into 2, part 1 and 2. So, the first one is called 6 Ways to Destroy Your Life. And, weird title that probably will make most people not want to read it. Sure. But, I wanted something that it's like, it kind of catches your attention, because usually we see titles of books like 10 ways to be healthier, 7 ways to be more positive, or to have your best life now, or whatever.
6 ways to destroy your life.
So really, and then the subtitle is "And the Life-Saving Alternatives." So it comes from, and then the second book is just 6 more ways. So it's really 12 specific ways, all taken from the book of Proverbs, where Solomon mentions 12 different sins that specifically the key word is destruction or destroy. Like he says, this will destroy you. For example, one that we all know, Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So one chapter is all on pride.
Yeah.
And basically discussing, okay, why is this sin so destructive? What about it will destroy our lives? What is God's view of it? What is the culture's view tend to be toward this sin? And then the following chapter is like the life-saving alternative to that sin. So in that case would be humility.
Wow.
In contrast to pride. So,
awesome.
I published the first one, I think 2 years ago, and then the other one last year. So
Let's go, man.
yeah, working on right now an apologetics book on Mormonism. So,
so you got to talk to him after.
Geeking
So-
about it for like a year now.
might publish that this year, but been pretty busy with a ton of stuff. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
thank you so much for taking your time to come on.
Yeah,
man.
thank you guys for having
Very
me.
fruitful
Happy to be here.
conversation.
Yes.
I really hope that you guys took a lot from this. I would even encourage you guys, like after this episode's over, just go and sit and meditate on everything we talked about. And I would even just ask the Lord, reveal to me how much you love me, and just let him feel, ask him to just let you feel, or if he'll let you feel just maybe a glimpse of what he went through and how much that he loves you and sees you. But, I just want to thank you guys so much for listening. I'm Gavin.
I'm Brandon.
Jonathan.
And this is a Grain of Salt podcast, the number one podcast that you should take with a grain of salt. We'll see you guys next week.
Peace.